We're coming up on 3 years since we got the keys to the first house that we bought in Italy. I've had some time to think about a few different things that I definitely would have done differently, knowing what I know now. If you want to think about it this way, these are the 3 things that you should avoid doing if you are looking to buy a house in Italy. Let's dive into number 1. I'm not sure if I would call this really a mistake, but it is a regret that I definitely do have, and that is not learning Italian before we arrived here. Although it might seem like an obvious thing that you might want to do if you're going to decide to completely change your scenery, move to a different country, and buy a house there, learning Italian for me before we arrived honestly wasn't really realistic, and I will give myself a little bit of grace with this one. When we were house hunting in Italy, my daughter was 10 or 11 months old. I was also working a full-time job, and learning a new language just was not realistic for me, and I did not have the time and energy to do that in my spare time. Do not get me wrong, I am not one of those ignorant Americans that think that the whole world should revolve around English. I 100% knew that we were expected to learn Italian upon living here. That was going to just come naturally, and it still is. My Italian is still not perfect, but obviously I can have a conversation 1,000 times more better than I did when we were house hunting. I really want to focus about the things that I would have done differently around the house buying process, so I'm going to tell you why I wish I knew Italian when we were just looking for the house. First off, most of the listing websites that you are going to see that list the houses for sale in Italy are going to be Italian websites. If you are looking at a website and everything is in English, that's probably your first sign that those houses are going to be a bit more expensive than what you can find elsewhere on a local website. Translating websites works, and I would say that it's accurate maybe 80% of the time, but you're still leaving a lot up in the air because it's not always going to be accurate and things just don't translate directly that you would want them to. If I knew Italian during the house hunting process, then I would be able to quickly just scan through listings a lot better without second guessing this language barrier. Then comes actually reaching out to the agents and communicating with agents. The thing in Italy with agents is that if you are not speaking Italian, and even if you write your email that is clearly just Google translated, then Italian agents might not want to deal with you simply because you do not speak Italian. If you email them in English, your chance of getting a response is pretty low compared to if you were to write that email in Italian. Then comes potential phone calls. Maybe you want to speak with the seller directly if you're not using an agent, or you want to talk to the agent on the phone. If you don't speak Italian, those things just become really difficult. When we were actually looking at the houses, so I'm talking about touring of the houses, I really wish I spoke more Italian so I could actually talk to the seller, because most of the times that we saw houses, the seller was actually present, which is something different than what you would experience in the US. Usually the seller and the buyer do not meet during the tour of the house. But in our case, the seller was there, and nobody knows more about the house than the actual seller. So it would have been really helpful to not have to go through the agent to translate every single little question if I just needed to ask the seller something very simple. Skipping ahead to after the deed is signed. We luckily had the agent set up our utilities for us, but again, if you do not opt for an agent, I honestly think that setting up the utilities yourself without speaking Italian might be impossible. There is obviously a lot of communication that goes into setting up your utilities after you buy a house. If we did not have the agent to help us with this, at that point, because we spoke zero Italian, we would have been so lost. Then there is local bureaucracy. If you need to go talk to your local municipality, your town hall essentially, and deal with some residency issues or residency paperwork, submit any paperwork with the town hall, and you do not speak Italian, things become very difficult, and it also can create a little bit of friction between you as a foreigner coming into this town and trying to live there without speaking Italian. Again, I'm not saying that we didn't have plans to learn Italian at all. That is not true. I just wish that we knew a little bit beyond just a couple of words at the stage of house hunting and the house buying process. Personally, it's just not a good feeling when you are part of a real estate transaction, which is a very adult thing to do, and you are sitting there like a 4-year-old because you can't express anything that you're thinking, you can't express your concerns, and that just makes you feel silly. If I were to go back to that moment and do things differently, I would have set aside a little bit of time, even though I already had extremely busy days. There's always maybe 30 minutes that I could have set aside to study Italian and take it more seriously. I wouldn't necessarily recommend anyone to learn Italian with an app like Duolingo. You're going to really want to buy a course if you want to speak Italian correctly. A more comprehensive course is going to be much more beneficial than a game app. I also would recommend to actually learn phrases and words that have to do with the home buying process. Maybe skip all the Italian course stuff that is on ordering at a restaurant. While yes, you are going to want to know that at some point, immediately you're probably going to want to know words that you are going to use with the real estate agent, with the notary, with the lawyer, with the seller, things that have to do with the house. So learn the words for doors, windows, the floor, electricity, stuff like that, and just skip over stuff that you're not going to need immediately. The second thing that I definitely would have done differently, knowing what we know now, is not rushing our renovation. We bought a house that technically you would not be able to live in as soon as you got the key and opened the door. It was not classified as habitable. We gave ourselves a tight and too tight of a timeline to make that house habitable. We rushed the renovations in order to be able to live in the house, and that just caused anxiety, stress, some mistakes, and we learned a lot. A part of this mistake comes from the fact that we just didn't know what we didn't know, and we didn't know how slow things happen in Italy, how they happen in Italy, and we just didn't know what to expect. While this timeline made sense on paper, maybe it even would have worked in a different country, it just did not work out in Italy. Somehow, miraculously, my husband did a really good job, and we did somehow manage to make the house livable and habitable in about 72 days. But if I were to do it again, I would have had a much more relaxed timeline and just knew to give ourselves some leeway and some padding in terms of timing. You simply cannot rush things in Italy. I think the rushed timeline originally stemmed from the fact that we had to get our utilities set up. And when you get utilities set up, it's not instant. Everything takes time, per usual. We didn't know exactly when the electricity was going to get turned on, when there was going to be water available, and so on. You need those fundamental things in order to do construction on a house. During the first week or so of renovations, I think Alex, my husband, was borrowing electricity from our neighbor who was really kind to offer that. But in an ideal world, you have everything you need within the house in order to do renovations. Then there was the stress of sourcing the materials and ordering things in time, because delivery times in Italy, especially if you are getting things shipped from abroad, so for example, we had some tiles shipped from Spain, things just take a little bit more time. And when you don't know exactly when things are going to be delivered, it makes the renovation timeline of a house much more difficult to handle. So there were a lot of factors like this that just caused the entire thing to feel very hectic, not very peaceful, and hard for us to enjoy at the time. I would say Alex did maybe 90% of the work on this first house himself, but for items specifically like plumbing, we do have two guys that we like to work with. We still work with them to this day, and they were the ones who originally helped us get the plumbing set up in this house that we currently live in. Although they are great guys, sometimes you just don't know when they're going to show up. So again, that added more stress to the original timeline of being able to get the house habitable, because we didn't know when we could count on them actually arriving and finishing the job. Although the job itself didn't take them long, it was just about getting them scheduled and getting them here. There are many things happening at once that you need to account for when you're renovating a house. So you can't really skip to step 3 if you still need step 1 and 2 completed. And again, although all of this looked really perfect on paper, once we put it into play and just kind of had to adapt to our environment and the situation and the rhythm of how things work here, it just didn't work out, and it was very stressful. I shouldn't say it didn't work out, because again, Alex was able to get the house in a habitable state in about 72 days, but there were some mistakes and some shortcuts that we had to make in order to achieve that. Some things that I definitely would have done differently in hindsight, I would have just accounted for more time, whether that's waiting on the contractors to come in, so the plumbers, or delivery times, just everything needed more time. The reason we were also rushing this renovation to be done by a certain time is because we had some travel plans that we could not cancel at that point. So we knew that if we were already here in Italy, we had to just get done what we needed to get done while we were physically here. Of course, if I knew that the plan wasn't really realistic, I wouldn't have made the travel plans to begin with, but we can't go back in time. If there's anything that you can learn from this mistake of ours, it's to just overestimate rather than underestimate. For example, if you go to see a house and you agree on a house that's also not habitable, but you have plans to renovate it and and maybe move in by next summer, you should assume that if the contractor tells you that it's going to be done by this month, just add on maybe 2 or 3 months onto that. I actually watched a video of a couple who also bought a house in Abruzzo, and they didn't get to move into their house until a year later. And from the video, it made it seem like they were assuming that they were going to move in a lot sooner, and that just didn't happen because, again, it's Italy and things just take longer. And number 3, this is the last major thing that I would have done differently if we were to buy a house in Italy again. I cannot explain how much we lucked out on this one. It could have turned out really poorly. The thing that I would have done so differently would be to actually research the area and get to know the area in general a little bit better. We were so focused on the houses themselves because of the price. I've mentioned this in other videos, but we were really obsessed with just getting the cheapest house possible in the best state possible, and we weren't focused or even aware of the areas that we were looking in. This might seem like an obvious factor that you might want to keep in mind when you're house hunting. For us, when you're in the moment and you're excited about properties, it just slipped our minds. It's not like it wasn't a focus. Obviously, I don't want to live right next to a freeway or anything like that, and I know where I am located, but knowing an area or even a town takes time, and we didn't give it any time. The biggest assumption that we made, and we were so wrong to do so, is assuming that many small Italian towns and villages are the same. After living here, you can quickly realize that that's just not true. If you've been watching any of my videos, you know that the town that we live in is fairly small. It has about 1,500 people living in it. Technically, it is not a village. There are little communes that are even smaller than ours and might have 500 people living there. There are many cheap homes in even smaller towns and smaller villages, hence that's why they're so cheap, because the town is really small and nobody really wants to live there. Although those options might be really great for someone looking for a vacation home, so not living here year round, it's not a very good base for a permanent resident like we are. We did not realize until after the fact that we bought our house that our town really has everything that we need. We have multiple butcher shops, we have bakeries, we have grocery stores. I have a place to get a facial, I get my nails done, we have a place to get our hair cut, we have a construction store. The list goes on and on. More importantly, there are multiple doctors, and we even have a medical center that will see you if you have an emergency. Again, like I said, we really lucked out, and we're so glad that we do live in a town that has services as important as a medical service. Having a place that you can go in the case of a medical emergency is something you definitely want to consider, especially maybe if you are older and you are looking to retire somewhere in Italy. You're going to want to know that there's access to emergency services. Do not make the assumption that we did and think that every town is alike and every town is going to have some level of basic services, because there are many small towns that literally have nothing in them besides maybe one bar where you can get coffee. In terms of the physical location, obviously you're also going to want to pay attention to that. We have a car and we are so used to driving. We take really long road trips. Long driving distances is really not a deterring factor for us. We're happy to drive anywhere that we need to. But if you are not like us, then you do want to take into consideration how long is it going to take you to get somewhere important, another major city, to get to the motorway, maybe to a major airport. You're going to want to not forget about these things and not get hung up on the house itself, but also just logistics of where it's located. Many inland towns in Abruzzo especially are not connected well by public transportation. For example, in our town, there is a bus that goes down to a major city on the coast, but it leaves at maybe 5 a.m. and then again at 6 a.m. So not really convenient times if you're just a typical person that might want to go there midday. The key takeaway here really is to just not assume, and you really want to ask basic questions that you might think are so basic that aren't worth asking, but you might forget about them because, again, you are just so into the process, you're excited about buying a house in Italy, and you're not really thinking logistically of how it's going to work out. Some other things that you might want to pay attention to when it comes to the location of the town that you want to buy a house in is if it's close to another town that has a bigger population, which means more amenities and more services. So for example, if you do find a house that you are completely in love with, but it's in a town with 500 people, there's barely a doctor there, but it is 15 minutes away from a really large town or city, then in my opinion, that's okay. Because as long as you're close enough to that big town with all those amenities and services that you need, then yeah, you can find a cheap house in a really small village, get a good deal on that, but still be close to what you need if it really comes down to it. If we had more time and money really wasn't a concern, then the things that I would have done differently here is possibly rent a place in the area for maybe a few weeks just to get a sense of it, because I really don't think that you can get a sense of a town, a region, or even a province just within a couple of days or house hunting. You really need to stay there for a couple of weeks, few weeks ideally, and just get a sense of the surroundings, the vibe, just the culture. It's very different throughout all of Italy. This is a step that you do not want to miss during the house buying process, is to just pause and separate the house itself from the actual area. Think about, do you like the house or do you like the area? If you get lucky, sometimes those two things intertwine and you get the best of both worlds. But it's important not to forget about one or the other during the process. And there we have it. Those are just a few of the major things that I definitely would have done differently if we were to buy a house in Italy again. Number one, learning Italian before you actually arrive. Number two, not rushing the renovation process. And number three, getting to know the area of where you're actually buying the house. All in all, it really did work out for us, but a lot of that had to do with luck. When you're making a big decision and also an expensive decision, you don't really want to leave that all up to luck. We just didn't know what to expect, and that's okay. When you're doing something like buying a house, let alone in a foreign country, you really do not want to leave the entire situation up to luck or chance. For us, it just worked out. I'm not sure luck was on our side, and I'm forever grateful for that. But if you do not pay attention, as we did not in some areas of the process, then you can really end up regretting where you buy the house or what house you buy, and you're just not going to have a good time. So if you are looking to buy a house in Italy, I really encourage you to do your research, extend your timeline, and don't rush into any decisions. If you are curious about any step in particular of the home buying process in Italy, or even just moving to Italy, then let me know in the comments so I can make more helpful videos. I'll see you next time.